The bank manager looked at my parents, then slowly turned the computer screen toward me. I'm sorry, but this account wasn't emptied by the bank. It was emptied by your parents. My mother immediately stood up. That's enough. But the bank manager wasn't finished. He printed one document, then another, then another. After the bank manager slid those documents across the desk, my entire world changed. 3 transfer receipts, 2 withdrawal forms, 1 account statement. Every page carried the same 2 signatures, my mother's, my father's. The college savings account I had believed simply disappeared hadn't disappeared at all. It had been emptied, deliberately, legally, by the 2 people who had spent 15 years telling me there was never enough money. But before I show you why they made that decision, and why they spent the next decade hiding it from everyone, you need to understand how I became the daughter whose future was always considered negotiable. My name is Sophia Carter. I'm 31 years old. For most of my childhood, I believed my parents loved my brother and me equally. Children don't usually notice favoritism. Not at first. It doesn't begin with one enormous decision. It begins with tiny moments, small choices, little sacrifices. One child always goes first, the other quietly learns to wait. My older brother Ethan was 2 years ahead of me. He was intelligent, confident, outgoing. Teachers loved him, neighbors admired him, relatives proudly called him the future doctor. Every birthday, he received science kits, microscopes, books about medicine. When guests visited our home, they always asked Ethan about school, about his dreams, about the university he hoped to attend. When they finally turned toward me, the questions were different. Are you helping your mother? Do you still enjoy drawing? No one asked about my future. Not because they were unkind, because my parents had already decided which child carried the family's biggest dreams. The funny thing was, I never blamed Ethan. He wasn't arrogant. He never demanded special treatment. In fact, he often shared his gifts with me. When he received a new bicycle, he spent the afternoon teaching me to ride it. When relatives handed him money for birthdays, he usually bought us both ice cream. He was my brother, not my rival. The rivalry existed only inside my parents' expectations. I discovered architecture when I was 11 years old. Our school organized a field trip to a historical building downtown. Most of my classmates admired the stained glass windows. I couldn't stop staring at the structure itself, the way sunlight entered through carefully designed spaces, the curves, the symmetry, the quiet beauty hidden inside ordinary walls. When we returned home, I spent weeks sketching houses in an old notebook, libraries, schools, community centers, anything I could imagine. Mom looked through my drawings one evening. They're beautiful, she smiled. You've got talent. It was one of the few compliments I still remember. As the years passed, that little notebook became several notebooks. I entered design competitions, stayed after school to learn computer drafting. My art teacher encouraged me to apply for architecture programs. She once told me, "You don't just draw buildings. You imagine how people will live inside them." Those words stayed with me, because she understood my dream better than anyone else. During my final year of high school, I studied harder than I ever had before. Late nights, early mornings, weekends spent preparing applications. Every sacrifice felt worthwhile. Then, one rainy afternoon, an envelope arrived. I recognized the university logo immediately. My hands shook as I opened it. The first word I saw was, "Congratulations." I screamed so loudly. Mom dropped a plate in the kitchen. Dad rushed into the living room. Ethan came running downstairs. "I got in!" I shouted through tears. "My dream school accepted me!" Dad smiled proudly. He hugged me. "I'm proud of you." Mom cried. For one evening, everything felt perfect. We celebrated with pizza, watched my favorite movie. Even Ethan raised a toast. To my future architect. I believed my future had finally begun. I had no idea. It was already being taken away. A few weeks later, the university mailed the tuition schedule. I carefully placed the letter on the dining room table. Dad looked it over, then smiled. "Don't worry. We've been saving for your education since you were born. I smiled back. I had heard those words my entire childhood. Every birthday when relatives gave me money, Dad would say, "We'll put it into your college account." Every Christmas, Grandma handed me an envelope. "For your future." When I won a regional design competition, the scholarship prize was deposited into that same account. I never questioned it. Why would I? I trusted my parents. Over the next month, I started preparing for university. I bought secondhand textbooks online, collected free furniture from neighbors. My best friend helped me decorate a tiny apartment near campus. Everything was falling into place. Until one Sunday evening, Dad asked me to sit down. Mom was already waiting at the kitchen table. Neither of them smiled. Immediately, I knew something was wrong. Dad cleared his throat. "Sophia, we need to talk about college." I nodded. "Did something happen?" He looked down, then quietly said, "I'm afraid we don't have the money." For a moment, I thought I had misunderstood. "What do you mean?" "The college fund," Mom whispered. "It's gone." I stared at both of them. "How?" Dad sighed deeply. "The economy. Unexpected expenses. We had no choice." I looked from one face to the other. "But you've been saving for 18 years. Mom reached for my hand. "There simply isn't enough left." I slowly pulled my hand away. "How much is left?" Neither of them answered. I asked again. "How much?" Dad finally whispered. "Almost nothing." The room felt strangely quiet. I couldn't hear the television anymore, or the rain outside, only my own heartbeat. Everything I had worked toward, every late night, every sketch, every application, every dream, collapsed in a single conversation. I looked toward Ethan. He had been standing silently near the hallway. He looked almost as shocked as I was. "I didn't know," he said quietly. I believed him, because the sadness on his face was real. But what none of us knew was that this wasn't the whole truth, not even close. The money hadn't disappeared. It hadn't been lost. And it certainly hadn't been spent the way my parents claimed. The truth was sitting inside a bank's financial records, waiting patiently for the day someone finally decided to look. For the next several days, I tried to convince myself there had to be another way. Scholarships, student loans, part-time jobs, anything. I spent hours searching online, calling financial aid offices, sending emails. I refused to believe 18 years of planning could disappear overnight. Then the university called. The admissions counselor spoke kindly. "We noticed your tuition hasn't been paid." "I know," I whispered. "I'm still trying to arrange the finances." She paused. "We can give you 2 more weeks." "I hope that's enough." I thanked her, hung up the phone, and cried harder than I ever had before. Not because I had lost hope, because I could feel it slipping away. For 2 weeks, I barely slept. I applied for every scholarship I could find. Some had already closed. Others required funding that wouldn't arrive until the following year. I visited 3 different banks. Each one gave me the same answer, without a cosigner. The loan amount wouldn't cover tuition. Dad refused to cosign. "It's too much debt," he said. "I won't let you ruin your future." The irony of that sentence wouldn't become clear until many years later. The final deadline arrived. I packed away the apartment decorations my friends had helped me collect, canceled my housing agreement, folded my acceptance letter, placed it inside a drawer, then emailed the university. I regretfully declined my admission. I read that sentence 10 times before pressing send. Afterward, I closed my laptop, sat on the floor, and stared at the wall. A dream I had spent years building ended with one email. The following Monday, instead of walking across a university campus, I started working at a local hardware store. The manager handed me a name badge, a store uniform, and a box cutter. As I stocked shelves that first morning, I watched students my own age driving toward the university. Some were laughing, some looked nervous, some carried oversized backpacks. I wondered which building would have been mine, which classroom would have held my first lecture. Instead, I was arranging paint cans in aisle 7. Life moved on. At least, it looked that way from the outside. During the day, I worked at the hardware store. At night, I took online drafting classes whenever I could afford them. They weren't part of a degree, just individual courses, enough to keep my dream alive. Sometimes, after finishing work, I'd sit in my car sketching building designs before driving home. Drawing reminded me that my dream wasn't completely dead, just postponed. Or so I hoped. Ethan left for medical school 3 weeks later. The entire family gathered to celebrate. Mom cooked his favorite meal. Dad invited relatives over. Everyone congratulated him. A future doctor. Our family's pride. I hugged my brother before he left. I'm proud of you. He hugged me back. I'm sorry things worked out this way. I smiled. It's not your fault. And I meant it. Ethan hadn't taken anything from me. As far as either of us knew, our parents had simply run out of money. The years passed quickly. Ethan studied medicine. I worked, first at the hardware store, then as an office assistant. Eventually, at a small architectural supply company. The owner noticed I understood blueprints better than most employees. One afternoon, he stopped beside my desk. You've got talent. Did you study architecture? I smiled sadly. I almost did. He looked confused. What happened? The money disappeared. He nodded quietly. I'm sorry. That was all he said. But somehow, those 3 words felt more compassionate than anything my parents had ever offered. Family gatherings became more difficult every year. Every conversation somehow returned to Ethan's success. He's top of his class. He'll make an excellent surgeon. We're so proud. Then someone would turn toward me. So, still working at that office? I smiled politely. Yes. Nobody asked why I wasn't an architect. Because my parents had already answered the question for them. One Thanksgiving, I overheard Mom talking to Aunt Susan in the kitchen. Sophia never really wanted university, Mom said. She preferred working. I froze. My heart began pounding. I stepped into the room. That's not true. Both women turned toward me. Mom forced a smile. I meant, you weren't passionate about college. I stared at her. I cried for weeks. You know that. She looked uncomfortable. People don't need every detail. No, I answered quietly. But they deserve the truth. The room became painfully silent. After dinner, Dad found me outside on the back porch. You embarrassed your mother. I looked at him. She lied. She simplified. No. She lied. He sighed. Sophia, the past won't change. Let it go. I looked across the backyard. I've tried. But every time someone says I never wanted college, you ask me to stay silent. Dad folded his arms. What good would arguing do? I looked directly into his eyes. I wouldn't be arguing. I'd be telling the truth. He didn't answer, because deep down, he knew the difference. Years continued passing. I slowly built a stable life. I rented a small apartment, bought my first used car, saved every extra dollar, piece by piece. I rebuilt what I could. Not because anyone helped me, because I refused to give up on myself. Sometimes, late at night, I still opened the folder containing my university acceptance letter. The paper had begun turning yellow. The edges were worn. But every time I looked at it, I imagined the life that might have been. Then, almost 13 years after giving up college, something happened that made me question everything I'd been told. Dad called one evening. His voice sounded unusually tense. Sophia, we're cleaning out the attic. We found some old financial papers. I think a few boxes belong to you. The next Saturday, I drove to my parents' house. The attic was filled with dusty boxes, old photographs, tax records, receipts, insurance documents. As I sorted through one cardboard box, a faded bank envelope slipped onto the floor. I almost ignored it. Then I noticed something. My name, printed across the front. Sophia Carter Education Savings Account. I frowned. Dad had told me the account was empty. Closed. Gone. So why, 13 years later, were documents about it still sitting in the attic? I picked up the envelope, just as my father climbed the attic stairs. The moment he saw it in my hands, the color drained from his face. For the first time in my life, my father looked afraid. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. I looked down at the faded envelope, then back at my father. He had always been calm, always composed. But that afternoon, something was different. His eyes never left the envelope in my hands. Finally, he forced a smile. Oh, I thought we'd thrown that away years ago. I frowned. Why? It's just old paperwork. He reached toward me. I'll take it. Without thinking, I stepped back.
No. His hand froze in midair. I'd like to look through it first. It's nothing important, he answered quickly. Just outdated bank records. I looked directly into his eyes. If they're so unimportant, why are you trying so hard to take them? For the first time, my father didn't have an answer. Mom climbed into the attic carrying another storage box. She immediately noticed the tension. What's going on? Dad answered before I could speak. Nothing. Sophia found an old bank envelope. Mom glanced toward it, then looked at Dad. For less than a second, I saw something pass between them. Not confusion, recognition, almost panic. It disappeared so quickly, I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. Mom smiled. Honey, those papers are ancient. The account was emptied years ago. I know, I replied. I'd still like to read them. She walked closer. There won't be anything useful inside. Maybe, I answered. But they're mine. The attic became very quiet. Finally, Dad sighed. Take them if you want. They won't change anything. At the time, I believed him. I thought the envelope contained nothing more than old statements. I had no idea. It contained the first thread. And once I started pulling, everything else would begin to unravel. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table. The envelope rested in front of me. It looked ordinary, yellowed from age. The corners were bent. The bank logo had nearly faded away. I carefully opened it. Inside were only 4 documents. The first was the original account agreement. Education Savings Account. Account holder, Sophia Carter. Opened, August 14th, 2005. I smiled. Dad had been telling the truth about one thing. The account really had existed. The second document listed yearly deposits, birthday money, Christmas gifts, scholarship awards, small monthly transfers. Every dollar had been carefully recorded. I slowly added the numbers together on my calculator. Nearly $78,000. Far more than I had imagined. I whispered, how could all of this just disappear? The third paper stopped me cold. It wasn't a bank statement. It was a transaction summary, but someone had torn away the bottom half. Only the top remained. Across the page, I could still read, transfer request. Date, July 18th.
The year had been ripped off. The destination account number was missing. Only one line remained visible. Authorized signature. The signature itself had been torn away, almost as if someone wanted the document to exist, without revealing what had happened. The final page was even stranger. It listed the account number. Nothing else. Just 16 digits. At the bottom, a small note read, "For account inquiries, please contact your local branch." I stared at the paper. Something about it didn't make sense. If the account had truly been emptied because of financial hardship, why keep only these documents? Why tear away part of the transfer form? Why leave the account number? Questions began replacing memories. The following Monday, I took a personal day from work. Instead of driving to the office, I drove to the downtown branch of Carter National Bank, the same branch my parents had used for decades. The building hadn't changed. The same marble floors, the same wooden service counters. Even the large clock on the wall looked familiar. I took a number, sat quietly, and waited. A young customer service representative greeted me. "How can I help you today?" I slid the account number across the desk. "I know this account is closed, but I'd like copies of any records you're allowed to release." She typed for a moment, then frowned. "I'm sorry. This account is archived. I'll need a manager." She disappeared into the back office. Several minutes later, a gray-haired man approached. His name tag read, "William Harris, branch manager." He smiled politely. "What seems to be the problem?" I explained everything. "My parents told me the education fund was exhausted years ago. I recently found these papers. I'd simply like to understand what happened." He nodded thoughtfully, then looked at the account number. Almost immediately, his expression changed. Not dramatically, just enough for me to notice. "Would you mind waiting a few minutes?" he asked. "Of course." He disappeared through a secure door. 10 minutes passed, then 15. I considered leaving. Finally, he returned carrying a thick archive folder, far thicker than I expected. He carefully placed it on the desk, then looked at me. "I'm afraid there's a complication." My stomach tightened. "What kind of complication?" He opened the folder. "There are records here. But before I release anything, I need to verify something." He paused. "May I ask, were you ever informed that someone requested duplicate statements from this account approximately 13 years ago?" I blinked. "No." He nodded slowly. "I thought not." "What does that mean?" "It means someone specifically asked the bank to remove certain records from the routine archive copies." I stared at him. "Can they do that?" "They can request duplicates. They can't erase the originals." My heart began beating faster. "So, you still have them?" He looked at me for several seconds, then quietly answered, "We keep everything." He excused himself once more. When he returned, he carried another folder. This one looked much older. A red stamp across the front read, "Original Transaction Archive." He placed it gently on the desk, then looked directly at me. "Miss Carter, I think you should prepare yourself." I frowned. "For what?" He rested one hand on the folder. "The documents inside may answer your questions, but they may also change the way you remember your family." I swallowed hard. My hands suddenly felt cold. Slowly, he opened the folder. The very first document inside was a complete transfer request. No torn edges, no missing signature, no missing destination account. Everything was there. And the name written beside the receiving account was one I recognized immediately. Ethan Carter Medical Education Fund. I couldn't breathe. For 15 years, I had believed my future disappeared because my parents had no choice. Now, for the first time, I realized they had made one. For several long seconds, I simply stared at the document. The words refused to make sense. Receiving account, Ethan Carter, Medical Education Fund. I read the line again, then a third time. My eyes moved to the transfer amount. 76842 laws and 15. Almost the exact balance that had been sitting in my education account. Not lost. Not stolen by a stranger. Not destroyed by the economy. Transferred. By choice. The branch manager, William Harris, didn't interrupt. He quietly allowed me to absorb what was in front of me. Finally, I looked up. There has to be some mistake. He shook his head gently. I've already verified the account numbers. What you're looking at is the original archived record. My voice barely came out. My parents told me the money was gone. Mr. Harris sighed. I can't speak about conversations that happened outside this bank. But I can explain what these records show. He turned the document toward me. This transfer was authorized in person. There were no banking errors, no fraud alerts, no disputes filed afterward. Everything had been processed exactly as requested. He carefully pulled another document from the folder. This is the withdrawal authorization. I looked down. 2 signatures appeared at the bottom. Richard Carter. Margaret Carter. My parents. There was no denying it. Their signatures matched every birthday card, every permission slip, every mortgage document I'd ever seen. My hands began trembling, not because I hated them, because I suddenly realized they had looked me in the eyes for 15 years and lied. Mr. Harris reached for another sheet. This is the internal transaction log. The bank keeps these for legal compliance. I frowned. What does it show? It records every step of the transfer. He pointed to the timeline. 9:08 a.m. Transfer request received. 9:17 a.m. Signatures verified. 9:31 a.m. Funds released. 9:36 a.m. Deposit completed into receiving account. Less than 30 minutes. 18 years of savings. Moved in half an hour. I whispered. So, while I believed my college fund had vanished, my brother's tuition was being paid. Mr. Harris remained silent. Bank employees aren't allowed to judge their customers. But his expression said enough. He understood exactly what those records meant. I leaned back in the chair. My mind replayed dozens of conversations from the past. Dad telling me, we simply couldn't afford it. Mom holding my hand across the kitchen table. We're heartbroken too. Every tear, every apology, every excuse had been built on a decision they already knew they had made. Then another thought struck me. Ethan. Did he know? Mr. Harris answered honestly. I have no way of knowing. The records only show who authorized the transfer. For some reason, that answer brought me a small amount of relief. Deep down, I had never believed Ethan would knowingly accept my future. Mr. Harris opened another section of the archive. There are additional documents. I frowned. What else is there? The correspondence file. He carefully removed several letters. They're copies of communication between the bank and the account holders. I unfolded the first letter. It thanked my parents for updating the account instructions. Nothing unusual. The second letter made my stomach tighten. Dear Mr. and Mrs. Carter, as requested, future correspondence regarding Sophia Carter's education savings account will be mailed only to the primary account holders. I stared at the page. What does this mean? Mr. Harris explained. When an account beneficiary becomes an adult, they can usually begin receiving statements directly. I looked back at the letter. My statements were stopped? He nodded. According to these records, yes. I swallowed hard. So I would never know what happened. I can't speak to their intentions, he answered carefully. But the mailing instructions were changed. Another memory surfaced. Just before graduating high school, I had asked Dad if I could see the account balance. He laughed. Don't worry about numbers. Focus on your exams. At the time, it sounded reasonable. Now, it sounded very different. Mr. Harris hesitated. There is one document I almost overlooked. He reached into the back of the folder. It was handwritten. A note made by the bank employee who processed the transfer. Internal observations, not intended for customers. He adjusted his glasses. I'm allowed to show you this because the retention period has expired. I read the note. Customer appeared emotional. Mrs. Carter asked whether beneficiary notification was required. Explained notification not necessary under current account authority. My heart pounded. Mom had asked, specifically, whether I would be told. I closed my eyes. She hadn't simply signed paperwork. She had made sure I wouldn't find out. For 15 years. Mr. Harris quietly slid a box of tissues across the desk. I've managed this branch for 22 years, he said softly. I've seen many difficult conversations. But very few records tell a story as clearly as these. I took a deep breath. I'd like copies of everything. He nodded. I expected you would. The printer in his office ran for nearly 20 minutes. Page after page emerged. Statements, transfer logs, authorization forms, archived correspondence, internal records. When he returned, the stack was nearly 2 inches thick. He placed it neatly into a binder, then looked directly at me. Miss Carter, I strongly recommend you keep these somewhere safe. They are original certified copies. If anyone questions what happened, these documents speak for themselves. I thanked him quietly, then stood to leave. My hand had already reached the office door when he spoke again. There is one more thing. I turned back. He looked uncomfortable. Normally, I wouldn't mention this, but considering what you've just learned, I think you deserve to know. He opened the archive one final time. There was another visit concerning this account. I frowned. When? Approximately 6 months after the transfer. Who came? He looked down at the visitor log. Your father. My stomach tightened. What did he want? He requested written confirmation that the account balance was 0. I couldn't understand. Why? Mr. Harris slowly closed the folder. I don't know. But according to the notes, he specifically asked for a document stating the funds had been exhausted. Exhausted. That was the exact word my parents had used. The same word. Repeated for 15 years. Not because it was true, because they had rehearsed it. I walked out of the bank carrying the binder against my chest. The afternoon sun was bright. Cars passed by. People hurried along the sidewalk. The world looked exactly the same. But mine had changed forever. I didn't know what I was going to say to my parents. I didn't know whether Ethan had any idea. I didn't know if our family could survive the truth. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I was done wondering. Done doubting my own memories. Done believing I had somehow imagined the pain of losing my future. The proof was in my hands. Signed, stamped, certified, undeniable. And before another week passed, those same financial records would force my entire family to confront the truth they had spent 15 years trying to bury. For 3 days, the binder never left my side. I didn't call my parents. I didn't call Ethan. I didn't tell my friends. Every night, I opened the documents again, hoping, almost praying, that I had misunderstood something. A missing page, a banking error, a simple explanation. But every time I read the records, they told the same story. The money had never disappeared. My parents had chosen where it would go, and they had chosen not to tell me. On the 4th morning, my phone rang. It was my mother. Sophia, are you coming to dinner on Sunday? I closed my eyes. The timing almost felt cruel. For years, Sunday dinners had been our family's tradition. Birthdays, graduations, holiday planning. Everything important happened around that dining table. This time, Something important would happen again, just not what anyone expected. I'll be there, I replied quietly. Sunday evening arrived. The dining room looked exactly as it always had. Mom's homemade lasagna filled the air with its familiar smell. Dad stood beside the grill in the backyard. Ethan arrived with his wife and little daughter. My niece ran into my arms. Aunt Sophia! She hugged me tightly. I drew you something. She proudly handed me a picture. It showed a beautiful building surrounded by flowers. I want to build houses like you someday. My heart nearly broke. I smiled. Then never let anyone tell you that your dreams are too expensive. She nodded without understanding. One day, she would. Dinner began normally. Dad talked about retirement. Mom discussed neighborhood gossip. Ethan shared stories from the hospital. Everyone laughed. For a few minutes, it almost felt like every other family dinner. Then Dad looked at me. So, how's work? I placed my fork on the table. It's going well. I'm actually working on a new community center design. He smiled politely. That's nice. Then he added the sentence I had heard countless times. Everything happens for a reason. I looked directly at him. Does it? He nodded confidently. I believe so. I slowly reached beside my chair, picked up the black binder, and placed it in the middle of the table. His smile disappeared. Mom frowned. What's that? Financial records, I answered. The ones I found this week. No one moved. I opened the binder. The first page showed my education savings account. The second, the transfer authorization. I gently turned both documents toward my parents. I went to the bank. The room instantly became silent. Dad didn't touch the papers. Instead, he looked at Mom. Mom looked back at him. Neither spoke. Finally, I asked the question that had waited 15 years. Why? No one answered. I asked again. Why did you spend my college fund? Dad rubbed his forehead. It's complicated. No, I replied. The bank records aren't complicated. They're very clear. Ethan leaned forward. What are you talking about? I turned another page. The certified transfer record. Receiving account. Ethan Carter, Medical Education Fund. He stared at it, then laughed nervously. That doesn't make sense. It has to, I said quietly. Your tuition came from somewhere. His smile slowly faded. I thought, he whispered. I thought you and I had separate savings. So did I answered. For the first time that evening, I realized Ethan truly hadn't known. He wasn't pretending. He looked completely stunned. Dad finally spoke. We didn't have enough money for both of you. I looked at him. So you decided for me. We made the best decision we could, Mom added. Ethan had already been accepted into medical school. We couldn't waste that opportunity. I felt tears forming. And my dream? Mom looked down. You were talented. But architecture wasn't guaranteed. Ethan becoming a doctor was. Those words hurt more than the transfer itself, because they revealed something deeper. My parents hadn't chosen money. They had chosen which child they believed was worth investing in. Ethan suddenly pushed his chair back. You told me my tuition came from your retirement savings. Dad looked away. We simplified things. No, Ethan replied sharply. You lied. It was the first time in my life I had ever heard my brother raise his voice at our parents. He stood up. You let me spend 15 years believing Sophia simply changed her mind. You watched me celebrate every graduation, every promotion, knowing she paid part of the price. Mom's voice trembled. You didn't pay. We did. Ethan slammed his hand on the table.
No.
He pointed toward the binder.
She did.
The room fell silent again. My niece quietly looked between the adults, confused. Her mother gently took her into another room. None of us wanted a child witnessing what came next. Dad took a long breath, then quietly admitted, "Yes." We transferred the money. I signed the papers. No excuses, no denial, just the truth. Finally. "But you have to understand," he continued. "We believed one successful doctor could eventually help the whole family. We thought Ethan would earn enough to support everyone." Mom nodded through tears. "We never imagined you'd still be hurting." I looked at her in disbelief. "You watched me work 2 jobs. You watched me give up university. You told everyone I never wanted college. How could you possibly think I wasn't hurting?" She couldn't answer, because there wasn't an answer. I slowly opened another section of the binder, the internal banknote. I slid it toward Mom. She read only one sentence before bursting into tears. Mrs. Carter asked whether beneficiary notification was required. I spoke quietly. "You asked the bank if they could keep it from me." She covered her mouth. "I was afraid." "Afraid of what?" "That you'd hate us." I nodded slowly. "And instead, you made sure I'd never know why." Ethan reached for the binder. He turned page after page, bank statements, certified copies, transfer logs. Every document carried my parents' signatures. When he reached the last page, he quietly closed the binder, then looked at me. His eyes were full of tears. "I'm so sorry." I shook my head. "You didn't know." "No," he whispered, "but I lived the life you were supposed to have." Those words echoed through the room. No one argued, because everyone knew. There was truth in them. Dad suddenly stood. His shoulders looked smaller than I had ever seen. "I thought one day you'd forgive us." I looked at him calmly. "You never gave me the chance. You built forgiveness on a lie." He lowered his head. For the first time, the father who had always believed he could explain everything had nothing left to say. But none of us knew. The biggest surprise was still waiting, because the financial records I had found were only the beginning. Someone else had been quietly keeping records too. Records that would reveal every conversation, every decision, and every reason my parents had tried so desperately to hide the truth. No one moved. The dining room that had once been filled with laughter now felt painfully quiet. The binder remained in the center of the table. Its pages had done something 15 years of arguments never could. They had replaced opinions with facts. For the first time, no one could claim they remembered things differently. The truth had been printed, signed, stamped, and preserved. I slowly stood. "I think I should go." Mom immediately looked up. "Please don't." Her voice cracked. "We've only just started talking." I looked at her sadly. "No. We've only just started telling the truth." I picked up the binder, turned toward the front door. Then Ethan spoke. "Sophia." "Wait." I stopped, but I didn't turn around. "I need you to hear something." When I faced him, he was holding his medical school diploma. It had been hanging in the hallway for years. He quietly removed it from the wall, then placed it on the dining room table. "I've looked at this diploma every day," he said softly. "I believed it represented my hard work." He paused. "It still does. But now, I know someone else's sacrifice is part of this story." His eyes filled with tears. "I can never give you back the years you lost. But I refuse to spend another year pretending they didn't happen." 2 days later, Ethan came to my apartment. He carried another folder, This one belonged to him. Inside were old tuition invoices, scholarship records, loan documents, and something I had never seen before. Receipts showing every tuition payment. Each payment matched, almost perfectly, the transfer dates from my education account. He sat quietly across from me. I spent 2 nights going through every financial record I still had. I wanted to be absolutely certain. I nodded. You were. He looked down. I hated what I found. I thought Mom and Dad made sacrifices for me. They did, he said bitterly. I just didn't know. They expected you to make them too. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then Ethan quietly asked, "Can you ever forgive me?" I looked directly at him. I never blamed you. You were lied to, too. He covered his face with both hands. I should have asked more questions. You trusted our parents, I answered. So did I. The following week, Dad called. 3 times. Then 5. Then every day. I didn't answer. Not because I wanted revenge. Because I finally understood something. Some conversations require silence before they deserve words. Almost a month passed. Then another letter arrived. Not from my parents. From attorney James Walker, the family attorney. He asked if I would meet him regarding additional financial documents discovered during a routine review of my parents' estate planning. Curious. I agreed. His office was lined with shelves filled with legal books. When I arrived, a large file rested on his desk. I've represented your parents for nearly 20 years, he said carefully. After everything that happened, I believed you should see these. He opened the file. Inside were handwritten notes from meetings held years earlier. One page immediately caught my attention. It was dated just 2 weeks before my college acceptance letter arrived. The note read, "Clients requested advice regarding transferring daughter's education fund to son's medical account." Below that, another sentence. "Attorney advised clients to fully disclose decision to both children." I stared at the page. They ignored your advice. He nodded quietly. They did. There are more, he continued. Another note. 6 months later. Clients requested assistance preparing written explanation for daughter. Another line. Meeting canceled by clients. Another. 3 years later. Attorney again encouraged family discussion. Clients declined. For 15 years, they had opportunities. Dozens of them. Not to change the decision, but to tell me the truth. Every single time. They chose silence. James Walker closed the file. I debated whether to show you these. Why? Because they don't change what happened. They only explain something. What? He looked at me. Your parents have lived with this decision far longer than you realized. They knew it was wrong. They simply lacked the courage to admit it. I drove home thinking about those words, not because they erased my pain. They didn't. But they answered one question that had haunted me. My parents hadn't forgotten. They remembered every single day. 3 months later, Dad appeared at my office. He looked older, smaller, almost fragile. He didn't come inside. He simply waited near the entrance. When I walked out, he held a worn leather notebook. I found this while cleaning the garage. He handed it to me. It's yours. Inside, I found my childhood sketchbook. The very first one. Every house I had ever imagined. Every library, every school, every impossible dream. I smiled sadly. I thought this was lost. Dad shook his head. No. I kept it. He looked away. Sometimes, I'd open it after you moved out. I'd wonder what your buildings would have looked like. His voice broke.
I stole much more than money. I stole the chance to find out. For the first time since everything had happened, I hugged my father. Not because everything was fixed, because grief had finally replaced pride. And that was where healing could begin. 6 months later, Ethan announced something unexpected. He was creating a scholarship, not in his own name, in mine. The Sophia Future Builders Scholarship. It would help students who had been forced to postpone college because of financial hardship. At the opening ceremony, he stood behind the podium. Hundreds of people filled the auditorium. Doctors, teachers, students, families. He looked toward me before speaking. My sister taught me something I should have learned much earlier. Success means very little if someone else had to lose their future so you could reach yours. The room became completely silent. Then everyone stood, not for him, for the story, for the truth, for the lesson. The scholarship grew every year. Students who believed their dreams had ended started receiving second chances. Some became engineers, teachers, architects, nurses. One afternoon, a young woman approached me after receiving her scholarship. She smiled through tears. "I was about to give up," she whispered. "Now, I don't have to." In that moment, I realized something. My parents had taken away one future, but the truth had created hundreds more. A year later, I finally graduated. Not at 22, at 33. The path had been longer than I ever imagined. But when I walked across that stage, I didn't think about the years I had lost. I thought about every person who had helped me keep going. My coworkers, my professors, Ethan, even my parents, who sat quietly in the front row. They didn't cheer louder than everyone else. They simply cried. Because they knew. This graduation should have happened years earlier. Today, I own a small architectural firm. We specialize in community libraries, affordable housing, and schools, the kinds of buildings that give other people opportunities. I almost lost myself. Above my office door hangs a simple wooden plaque. It isn't expensive. It isn't decorative. It simply says, "The future should never depend on favoritism." Every morning, before I unlock the office, I read those words. Not because they remind me of what my parents did, but because they remind me of the promise I made to myself. No child, no student, no dream should ever be treated as less valuable than another. Because the greatest investment parents can make isn't choosing one child's future over another's, it's believing every child deserves one.